Welcome to Creepy Vibes. Tonight we're descending into the shadowed depths of Texas's most haunted cemeteries, places where the ground itself feels hungry and the air tastes like rust. These are two terrifying encounters, tales of those who dared to trespass where the dead refused to sleep. From the cursed silence of Oakwood Cemetery to the nightmare whispers of Evergreen, these stories will claw at your sanity and make you question what waits beyond the veil. But before we begin, let me warn you. Most viewers make one huge mistake. They leave without subscribing. And because of that, they miss the darkest tales that only true horror fans dare to hear. If you don't want to miss the stories that haunt even the toughest souls, hit that subscribe button now, because what I'm about to reveal is only the beginning, and the darkness of Texas has so much more to unveil. And tell me, where are you watching from? And what time is it there? Because here, it's always night, and the voices never truly go quiet. Oakwood Cemetery sprawled across the rugged Texas landscape like a scab, old stones jutting from the earth like the jagged teeth of some long-buried beast. It was one of the oldest burial grounds in Austin, a place tangled with history, bloodshed, and rumor. The kind of place that felt like it absorbed death like a sponge. The graves were haphazardly arranged, some with granite angels weathered smooth by decades of harsh Texas sun, others bearing only cheap wooden crosses half swallowed by weeds. An iron fence surrounded the cemetery, paint flaking away to reveal the rust beneath. The bars bent and twisted where kids had squeezed through over the years. But the most unsettling thing about Oakwood was the quiet. Not the absence of sound, but the smothering of it. The way birds went silent near the north corner. How the wind would die down, leaving only the dry rustle of leaves that somehow never seemed to fall. Julia first heard about the place from Carla, who was always hunting for the next urban legend to pick apart over beers and late-night arguments. "They call him the Watcher," Carla had said, leaning across the sticky table at their favorite dive bar, her eyes gleaming with tipsy enthusiasm. "People say he's always there, just standing, watching, especially around Halloween." "People say a lot of dumb shit," Julia replied, smirking over the rim of her bottle. "Probably just some homeless dude living there, or a caretaker, messing with people. You want to go scare yourselves, knock yourselves out." Carla had laughed, but Matt had nudged her with an elbow, a grin plastered across his scruffy face. "What, Jules? Too chicken to see for yourself?" That's how it started. A taunt and a dare with Julia's pride tied up in a neat little bow. She was the rational one, the skeptic. She couldn't just brush off the challenge. They picked Halloween night for the trip, half for the atmosphere, half because they'd already planned to spend the night drinking and telling ghost stories. Why not make a real one? It was past midnight by the time they slipped through the gap in the fence. Julia was half drunk but still steady enough to feel the cold scrape of the air against her skin. Matt carried a flashlight, its beam flickering like a dying heartbeat as they crept through rows of graves. Carla recorded the whole thing on her phone, her voice pitching high and jittery as she narrated. "Here we are, Oakwood Cemetery, the legendary home of the Watcher. We're going to see if the stories are true or if it's all just bullshit to keep kids away from the dead." The cemetery seemed to breathe around them, the air thick and cool, laced with the scent of wet leaves and something sharper, like metal. Gravel crunched beneath their sneakers as they walked deeper into the overgrown maze. "See anything yet?" Carla whispered, her voice trembling despite the bravado she tried to project. "Just headstones and dead grass," Julia replied, eyes scanning the darkness with a mixture of boredom and contempt. Spooky as hell. But even she felt it, the way the quiet wrapped around them like a straitjacket pressing tight against her ribs. They reached the oldest part of the cemetery, where the stones were cracked and moss-ridden, names worn down to smooth, unreadable curves. Matt cracked open another beer and passed it to Carla, who laughed a little too loudly, her voice echoing off the granite slabs. "Hello, Mr. Watcher, you there?" Carla called, waving her phone like an idiot. "Shut up," Julia hissed, her irritation sharpening. "Jesus, Carla, you're gonna piss off the groundskeeper or something." "What groundskeeper?" Matt chuckled. Place hasn't been maintained in years. It's just us and the ghosts. Don't say that, Carla muttered, and Julia caught the tremor in her voice. It was Matt who saw it first. Guys, look. The laughter died in their throats. What Julia saw at first was just a smear of shadow between the graves, but then it stretched up impossibly tall, something like a man but not quite. The shape wavered, its outline blurry, as if struggling to maintain its own form. Its eyes were the worst part. They gleamed in the dark, a sickly, rotting yellow, like lanterns left too long in the rain. And its mouth twisted into a grin, splintered and jagged as if it had been torn open with rusted wire. Carla screamed and ran. Matt followed a second later, their voices cracking into the night like breaking glass. But Julia stayed. Frozen, the thing glided toward her in a series of flickering, jittery steps, the way a film might stutter if someone had chopped out half the frames. Julia's skin prickled, her breath coming in short, desperate bursts. She could feel its cold breath on her skin, an impossible chill that burrowed deep, setting her nerves on fire. The scent of wet earth clung to her, suffocating. She stumbled backward, her legs finally obeying her, and ran. They found her the next morning, standing at the cemetery's entrance, her hair streaked with white like frost-bitten leaves. Her eyes were dull, unfocused. She barely responded to her friend's frantic questions. She never spoke of what she'd seen. But Julia never went near Oakwood Cemetery again, and Carla and Matt began to notice something about her. On nights when her nightmares were at their worst, her eyes would flash, just for a moment, a strange silvery glow that shimmered in the darkness before fading back into haunted blue. She moved away not long after. Carla would still hear from her sometimes, a text or voicemail that sounded flat and lifeless, like Julia was trying to force the warmth into her words and failing. Last Carla heard, Julia had been hospitalized for sleep deprivation, talking about eyes in the dark, something always watching. But the worst of it came 6 months later. When Carla passed Oakwood Cemetery on her way home from work one evening and saw a figure standing just beyond the gate, tall, staring, eyes glowing like sickly, rain-soaked lanterns. Evergreen Cemetery in El Paso is a different kind of desolation. The place is dusty and dry, grave markers half buried by relentless winds and time's uncaring fingers. Scraggly mesquite trees clawed at the sky, their branches brittle and bare even in the summer heat. Stones cracked and bleached from the sun jutted from the earth like old bones. People avoided Evergreen, not out of any respect for the dead, but because it felt wrong. The way some places do, with their silence too thick, the air too heavy. It was a patch of land that had soaked up its own history and turned sour. Victor had heard the stories growing up, just like every kid in the area. Tales of ghostly children playing hide-and-seek in the night, their laughter echoing across the flat, empty land. Supposedly, if you heard the laughter, it was already too late. They'd found you. But Victor didn't believe that crap. Not at 12 years old. He was almost a teenager, and he was determined to prove to his little brother Ricky that there was nothing scary about the cemetery. It was Ricky's fault, really. All summer long, he'd clung to Victor like a shadow, scared of monsters under the bed or killers lurking in the closet. So when Ricky dared Victor to sneak into Evergreen with him on that blistering August afternoon, Victor saw his chance to toughen the kid up. The air shimmered with heat, waves rolling off the asphalt as they biked up the hill toward the cemetery. It was the kind of day that made you feel like you were cooking from the inside out, sweat sticking their shirts to their backs like a second skin. See? Victor said, pushing open the rusted gate that groaned in protest. It's just a bunch of old rocks and dead flowers. Nothing scary here. Ricky hesitated, his hand tightening around the strap of his backpack like it was a lifeline. Dad says kids aren't supposed to be here. Dad says a lot of things. Victor rolled his eyes. Besides, what's he gonna do? Spank us? I'm too old for that. Ricky's reluctance melted a little, his shoulders sagging as he followed. Victor through the gate. They roamed between the rows of graves, chasing each other through the dry grass and dust clouds. Ricky's laugh came easily enough, his fears drowned out by the simplicity of play, until they heard the other laughter. High-pitched, ringing like glass bells. Victor stopped dead, his own chuckle crumbling into silence. He glanced at Ricky, who stood a few feet away, frozen mid-step. "There's other kids here," Ricky whispered, his eyes wide and gleaming. Victor's first thought was of other boys from school sneaking in for a dare like they were. Or maybe some bored teenagers trying to scare the crap out of them. But then he saw them. Small shadowed shapes darting between the graves. Too fast to be real. Boys and girls with clothes that seemed wrong. Old-fashioned, like something out of a black and white movie. Barefoot, their skins smudged with dirt, their hair tangled and wild. Victor opened his mouth to call out, but his voice seemed locked in his throat. Ricky made a soft, choking sound. And then one of them stepped closer. She was a little girl, maybe 7 or 8. Her dress was white once, but now it was stained with something dark and crusted. Her hair fell over her shoulders in tangled knots, but it was her face that made Victor's knees threaten to buckle. Her eyes were hollow, just black pits where the light died and didn't come back. But her mouth stretched into a grin, too wide and sharp, as if her lips had been split at the corners. Victor stumbled backward, grabbing Ricky's arm. His brother's skin felt clammy, his pulse fluttering under Victor's grip like a trapped bird. "Run," Victor gasped. They tore through the cemetery, dodging gravestones and kicking up clouds of dust. Ricky's breath came in panicked sobs, but Victor barely registered the sound. He could feel them, those children, chasing, just out of sight but close enough for him to hear their laughter. They burst through the gate, Victor slamming it shut behind them with a clatter of metal against metal. They didn't stop running until they were home, the door locked and the curtains drawn tight against the fading light. But the laughter lingered. That night, Victor lay awake, staring at the ceiling fans spinning lazily above him. Ricky had been quiet since they'd returned, his face pale and drawn. Their parents had written it off as sunstroke, too much time spent out in the heat. But Victor knew better. He heard Ricky muttering in his sleep, names he didn't recognize, the words slurred and frantic. "I don't want to play anymore. Let me go." The dreams didn't stop. Ricky grew thinner, his cheeks hollowing out, his eyes always rimmed with dark, sleepless circles. Their parents blamed it on nerves, school stress, anything but what had happened at Evergreen. One night, Victor woke to the sound of the back door creaking open. He found Ricky in the yard, his bare feet torn and bloody from stumbling over gravel and thorns. His lips moved without sound, his eyes glassy and unseeing. "They said I had to finish the game," Ricky whispered, his voice thin and broken. "They won't leave me alone until I finish." A month later, Ricky was gone, disappeared from his own bed. No sign of a struggle, no footprints, nothing. The police searched, the community rallied, but Victor knew the truth. The children had taken him back to Evergreen. Years later, when Victor returned out of some twisted need to prove it was all in his head, he saw them again. The children watched, him from the shade of a bent oak, eyes gleaming like shards of ice. They hadn't aged a day, and Ricky was with them. His smile was too wide, his eyes black and empty, and he was laughing.